Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt utterly alone, bearing the weight of their mockery like stones upon your chest? Today's story reaches into that raw, vulnerable place where faith meets humiliation, where silence speaks louder than defense, and where an unexpected confession reveals that what the world ridicules might be the very thing it desperately craves. This is a tale about peace, not the absence of conflict, but the profound, unshakable tranquility that survives even in the furnace of public shame. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across 47 wooden desks arranged in ascending rows. Micah Brennan sat in the third row, center seat, his worn notebook open before him, a mechanical pencil resting between calloused fingers that bore the evidence of weekend construction work that helped pay his tuition. He was 22 years old, lean and muscular from manual labor, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and eyes that held a quietness people often mistook for weakness. His navy blue cotton shirt, softened by countless washings, bore a small tear near the left shoulder seam, a remnant from last week's roofing job that he hadn't found time to mend. On his right wrist, barely visible beneath his sleeve, a thin leather cord held a small wooden cross, hand-carved and smooth from years of absent-minded fingering during moments of prayer or anxiety. Dr. Dalton Hargrove stood at the front of Philosophy 321. His grey suit jacket precisely tailored, his salt and pepper hair swept back from a high forehead that seemed to radiate intellectual authority. At 57 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had published 12 books, received tenure 20 years prior, and could reduce undergraduate arguments to rubble with a single well-placed question. His blue dress shirt, crisp and unwrinkled, suggested a life of order and control. A gold wedding band glinted on his left hand, though those who knew him well understood it was more memorial than marriage, his wife having left him 7 years ago for reasons he refused to discuss. The lecture hall held that peculiar silence that precedes a storm. "So," Dr. Hargrove said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a former smoker, "we arrive at the question of faith versus reason. The eternal conflict between believing what cannot be proven and accepting only what evidence supports." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the classroom like a lighthouse beam. "Mr. Brennan, I notice you've been particularly quiet during our discussions of Nietzsche this week." Micah looked up. 46 pairs of eyes swiveled toward him. The pencil in his hand stilled. "I've been listening, sir," he said quietly. "Listening." Dr. Hargrove smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Tell me, Mr. Brennan, do you find Nietzsche's critique of Christianity compelling, or does it trouble your—" He paused, letting the word hang. "Sensibilities." The leather cord tightened slightly around Micah's wrist as his pulse quickened. He had learned, over 3 months in this class, that Dr. Hargrove possessed an uncanny ability to identify the faithful among his students and subject them to what he called rigorous intellectual examination, but what felt distinctly like targeted humiliation. "I think Nietzsche raises important questions," Micah said carefully, "but I don't agree with all his conclusions." "Ah!" Dr. Hargrove turned to the whiteboard, uncapped a blue marker. "Let me write something down." His hand moved in broad, confident strokes. "The Christian faith," Nietzsche tells us, "is fundamentally life-denying. It creates slaves who worship weakness. It teaches people to accept suffering rather than overcome it. It promises pie-in-the-sky rewards for earthly misery." He turned back. "Tell me, Mr. Brennan, as someone who presumably subscribes to this worldview, do you consider yourself a slave?" The classroom held its collective breath. Someone coughed. A laptop fan whirred. "I consider myself free," Micah said softly. "Free." Dr. Hargrove walked slowly toward Micah's row, his footsteps deliberate against the linoleum floor. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "Free to believe in an invisible deity who watches your every move. Free to follow rules written thousands of years ago by Bronze Age shepherds. Free to sing songs to an empty sky." He stopped at the end of Micah's row. "That's a peculiar definition of freedom, wouldn't you say?" Micah felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I would say that freedom means being unshackled from the need to prove my worth through achievement or others' approval. It means knowing I'm valued regardless of success or failure." "Valued by whom?" Dr. Hargrove's eyes glinted. "Your imaginary friend?" A few students laughed. Nervous, uncomfortable laughter that died quickly in the fluorescent silence. "By someone who loves unconditionally," Micah said. "Even when I fail, even when I'm mocked." "Ah, martyrdom." Dr. Hargrove nodded slowly. "The ultimate Christian fetish. Tell me, class, what do we call someone who voluntarily accepts suffering because they believe it makes them virtuous?" He didn't wait for an answer. "A masochist. And what Mr. Brennan here represents is the perfection of 2,000 years of trained helplessness. The complete internalization of slave morality." Micah's hands trembled slightly, but he kept them flat against his notebook. The wooden cross pressed against his wristbone, a small reminder of something larger than this moment. He thought of his grandfather, who had survived war and poverty with a peace that had made no earthly sense, but had transformed everyone who knew him. He thought of the single mother in his church who smiled despite cancer, despite hospital bills that climbed higher than mountains, despite pain that would have broken most people like dry twigs. He said nothing. "No response?" Dr. Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "No defense of your faith?" "I don't think anything I say will change your mind, sir," Micah said quietly. "At last, an honest statement. You're right. Nothing you could say would convince me that wishful thinking constitutes truth, but I appreciate your refreshing lack of martyrdom." He turned back toward the front of the room. "Class, this is what happens when emotion replaces logic, when comfort replaces truth, when humanity decides that pleasant lies are preferable to harsh realities." The lecture continued. Micah's pencil remained motionless for the rest of the hour. When the class ended, students filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with Micah as though mockery might be contagious. One girl, Rebecca Walsh, with her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a green sweater that had seen better days, paused beside his desk. "That was rough," she whispered. "You okay?" "Yeah," Micah managed a small smile. "Not the first time." "I know. I've noticed." She glanced toward the door where Dr. Hargrove stood, organizing his leather briefcase. "He's been going after you all semester. It's not fair." "Fairness wasn't promised," Micah said, gathering his notebook. The torn shoulder of his shirt caught on the desk corner, ripping the seam another quarter-inch. He sighed. "Just truth, eventually." Rebecca nodded, though she looked uncertain. "Still, you handle it better than I would. I'd have exploded by now." After she left, Micah sat alone in the empty classroom, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of campus life filtering through the closed windows. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his construction foreman confirming tomorrow's 6 o'clock morning start time. His shoulders ached already, anticipating the weight of shingles and hammers. His wallet held exactly $47 until Friday's paycheck, and his cupboard at home held mostly rice and canned beans. Yet beneath the exhaustion, beneath the sting of humiliation, there existed a peculiar lightness, a knowing, a peace that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with being anchored to something immovable. He stood, shouldered his backpack with its broken zipper and fraying straps, and walked out into the late October afternoon, where leaves fell like copper rain. What Micah didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Dr. Dalton Hargrove stood at his office window 3 floors above, watching the young man cross the quad with his worn backpack and torn shirt, and feeling something he hadn't felt in decades. Envy. Pure, burning, inexplicable envy. The semester ground forward like a millstone. Dr. Hargrove's attacks became more pointed, more personal, though always wrapped in the civilized language of academic discourse. In week 7, he assigned a paper on the psychology of religious delusion and required all students to analyze their own belief systems. Micah wrote honestly about his faith, knowing it would be dissected. When the paper returned, it bore an 82, fair enough academically, but the marginal notes dripped with contempt. Circular reasoning, unfalsifiable claims, emotional arguments masquerading as logic. In week 9, during a discussion of moral philosophy, Dr. Hargrove proposed a scenario. Imagine you're hiding refugees during wartime. Soldiers come to your door. Do you lie to save lives, or tell the truth and watch them die? Mr. Brennan, enlighten us with your Christian perspective. Micah considered. I would lie to save them. Ah, but doesn't your holy book command you not to bear false witness? It also commands us to love our neighbors, to protect the vulnerable. Sometimes competing principles require wisdom rather than legalism. So you admit your moral framework contains contradictions? I admit it requires thoughtfulness rather than rigid formulas. Dr. Hargrove smiled thinly. That's an interesting way to describe intellectual inconsistency. But through it all, Micah remained steady. He continued attending class, taking notes, participating when called upon. He answered questions honestly, defended his positions without aggression, and accepted criticism without bitterness. His classmates began to notice. Some thought him weak, others suspected hidden depths. Timothy Vogel, a philosophy major with ambitions toward graduate school, cornered Micah after class one November afternoon. How do you do it? Timothy asked, genuinely curious. He was tall and gangly, his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually sliding down his narrow nose. His grey hoodie swallowed his thin frame. Do what? Take his abuse without fighting back, without breaking. Micah shrugged. I'm not interested in winning arguments. I'm interested in living truthfully. Those are different goals. But doesn't it make you angry? He's basically calling you stupid every class. He's challenging my ideas, that's his job. Micah adjusted his backpack. And anger only clouds judgment. I've learned that the hard way. Timothy studied him like a fascinating specimen. You really believe all that stuff, don't you? The faith thing, the peace thing. I do. Why? Micah paused. How could he explain the ineffable? How could he describe the moment 7 years ago when his life had nearly ended? When prescription pills and a bottle of cheap vodka had seemed like the only solution to pain he couldn't articulate, and a strange, overwhelming presence had flooded his tiny apartment, had filled his chest with something that felt like being known completely, and loved anyway, had given him a reason to dial 911 before the darkness took him permanently? How could he describe the slow, painful rebuilding that followed? The way peace had grown like a tree from the scorched earth of his former life. Because I've seen what life looks like without it, he said finally, and I prefer this. Timothy nodded slowly. Hargrove doesn't see it that way. He thinks faith is self-medication, opiate of the masses and all that. I know. Doesn't that bother you? His opinion doesn't change what's true. Man, Timothy shook his head. You're either the most delusional person I know, or the sanest. I can't figure out which. Micah laughed, a genuine warm sound. Maybe both. The November rains came, turning the campus into a watercolor painting of grays and browns. Micah's construction work slowed as weather made roofing dangerous. His bank account dwindled. The tear in his shirt shoulder grew larger. His boots, already worn thin at the soles, developed a split along the left side that let in water during his walk to campus. He stuffed cardboard inside, replaced it daily, kept moving forward. In week 12, Dr. Hargrove announced a debate assignment. Students would be paired randomly to argue positions they disagreed with. Micah drew atheistic materialism and would face Rebecca, who drew religious faith. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This will be illuminating, Dr. Hargrove said, his eyes on Micah. Watching Mr. Brennan attempt to defend a rational position should prove instructive about the limits of his intellectual capabilities. That night, Micah sat in his small studio apartment, a single room with a Murphy bed, a hot plate, and a bathroom the size of a closet, researching materialist philosophy. His laptop, purchased used 5 years ago, groaned under the weight of multiple browser tabs. The radiator clanked and hissed, providing sporadic heat. Rain drummed against the single window, beyond which streetlights created halos in the mist. He read Dennett and Dawkins, Harris and Hitchens. He studied their arguments carefully, honestly. And as he read, something unexpected happened. He found himself understanding their perspective more deeply, not agreeing but understanding, seeing how pain and hypocrisy and religious abuse could drive people away from faith, seeing how the silence of heaven in the face of suffering could feel like abandonment rather than mystery. He thought of his own journey, the years of questioning, the nights of anger and doubt, the slow emergence of something he couldn't explain but couldn't deny. The debate took place on a grey December afternoon when the first snowflakes drifted past the classroom windows like ash. Rebecca argued for faith with earnestness but little nuance, relying heavily on emotional appeals and personal testimony. Micah countered with the steel logic of materialist philosophy, presenting the argument for a universe without purpose or transcendence with unexpected eloquence. "If matter is all that exists," he said, standing at the front of the room, "then consciousness is merely electrical impulses in neural networks. Love is chemical reactions. Purpose is illusion. We are, in Dawkins' words, dancing to our DNA. This worldview requires no appeals to the supernatural. It demands no faith in the unprovable. It accepts the universe as it demonstrably is, without wishful additions." Dr. Hargrove leaned forward in his seat, surprise flickering across his features. "But," Micah continued softly, "if this is all that exists, then nothing ultimately matters. No action carries weight beyond its immediate consequences. Beethoven's symphonies are no more meaningful than elevator music, both just vibrations in air. Mother Teresa's compassion and Hitler's genocide are morally equivalent, just different evolutionary strategies. The love you feel for your child, the grief you feel for your dead, all illusions, convincing ones perhaps, but illusions nonetheless." He paused. The classroom was absolutely silent. "I can argue this position because I understand it, because I've stood at the edge of that abyss and looked in, and what I found there wasn't liberation or enlightenment." His voice dropped lower. "It was despair so profound it nearly killed me, because if nothing matters, then my suffering doesn't matter, my joy doesn't matter. I don't matter, and I couldn't live in that world. So you chose comfortable lies instead," Dr. Hargrove said quietly. Micah turned to face him. "No, sir. I chose life over death. And I found that life required meaning, and meaning required something beyond myself. That's not weakness, that's survival." For the first time all semester, Dr. Hargrove had no immediate response. The debate ended with polite applause. Grades were recorded. Students filtered out into the early December darkness. Micah remained at his desk, gathering his materials. Dr. Hargrove approached, his footsteps softer than usual. "That was unexpectedly sophisticated," the professor said. "Thank you. You argued materialism better than most atheists I know. I've read widely." Dr. Hargrove studied him with something like puzzlement. "And yet you reject it." "Yes." "Why?" Micah looked up. In the professor's eyes he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A hunger, a searching, a question that went deeper than academic exercise. "Because I need truth more than I need comfort," Micah said quietly. "And truth, in my experience, isn't found through reason alone. Sometimes it finds you." Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "That's mystical nonsense." "Maybe, but it's my nonsense." Micah stood, shouldered his backpack. "And it's kept me alive." He walked past the professor into the snowy evening, leaving Dr. Dalton Hargrove standing alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by the ghosts of arguments won and battles that suddenly felt hollow. That night, Dr. Hargrove sat in his oak-panelled office on the third floor of Weatherby Hall, staring at the computer screen where student evaluations glowed in harsh blue light. Outside his window, snow continued falling, building silent drifts against the old brick buildings. His office was immaculate, books arranged by subject and author, papers filed precisely, nothing out of place. On his desk sat a single photograph in a silver frame. His wedding day, 23 years ago, before his wife's smile had hardened into resentment, before she'd finally left with the simple statement, "I can't live with someone so certain about everything and so empty inside." He'd won that argument too, logically dismantled her emotional reasoning, proven her perspective flawed, and she'd left anyway. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, withdrew a bottle of 20-year-old scotch and a crystal tumbler. The first drink went down smoothly. The second, less so. By the third, his carefully maintained walls began to crack. He thought about Micah Brennan, that torn shirt and worn boots, that infuriating peace in the face of mockery, that complete lack of defensiveness despite having every reason to lash out. Dr. Hargrove had published 12 books. He'd received awards. He'd influenced countless students. His name appeared in citation indexes. His theories were discussed at conferences. He'd built an empire of intellectual achievement, and he was exhausted, bone deep, soul sick, exhausted. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept without medication, the last time he'd felt joy rather than satisfaction, the last time he'd experienced peace rather than merely the absence of conflict. His hands trembled as he poured a fourth drink. The classroom scene replayed in his mind, Micah standing there vulnerable and undefended, speaking about survival and meaning with the authority of someone who'd actually faced the abyss. Not theoretically, actually. "I need truth more than I need comfort." The words haunted Dr. Hargrove, because he'd spent decades claiming the same thing. But had he? Or had he built a fortress of logic to defend against questions that terrified him? Had he attacked students like Micah, not because their faith was weak, but because their peace was strong, and their strength revealed his own hidden hollowness? The snow outside his window continued falling, covering everything in white silence. Dr. Hargrove stood at his office window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, watching students traverse the quad below. Most walked in groups, laughing, their breath visible in the December air. But one figure walked alone, shoulders hunched against the wind, backpack heavy, boots leaving dark prints in the fresh snow. Even from 3 stories up, Dr. Hargrove recognized him. Micah Brennan, heading home after another long day of classes and construction work, that torn shirt barely visible beneath a thin jacket inadequate for the weather, those worn boots letting in water with each step. And Dr. Hargrove, standing in his temperature-controlled office, wearing his precisely tailored suit, holding his expensive scotch, felt something crack inside his chest. He'd spent the semester tearing this kid apart, publicly humiliating him, mocking his faith, questioning his intelligence, all in the name of rigorous intellectual discourse. But what had it accomplished? Had Micah renounced his faith? No. Had he become bitter or angry? No. Had he fought back or argued or defended himself with anything but quiet honesty? No. Instead, he'd endured, not with gritted teeth stoicism, but with genuine peace. And in enduring, he'd revealed something Dr. Hargrove couldn't explain away with psychology or philosophy or any of his carefully constructed arguments. He'd revealed that peace was possible. Real peace, not the fragile ceasefire of a life carefully controlled, but the deep, unshakable tranquility of a soul at rest. And Dr. Dalton Hargrove wanted it, desperately, achingly wanted it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He, who had spent 20 years dismantling faith, suddenly found himself envying the faithful. He who had mocked belief as weakness suddenly recognized strength he didn't possess. He who had claimed superior rationality suddenly felt like a fool. The scotch in his hand trembled, liquid gold catching lamplight. "I'm 57 years old," he whispered to the empty office, "and I don't know a single moment of peace." The admission broke something fundamental. He set down the tumbler, but his hand continued shaking. His carefully maintained composure crumbled, and standing there in his immaculate office, surrounded by the evidence of his intellectual accomplishments, Dr. Dalton Hargrove, published author, tenured professor, rational materialist, began to weep. Not tears of sadness, exactly. Tears of recognition, of finally admitting what he'd hidden even from himself. He was empty, successful, accomplished, respected, empty. And the kid he'd been mocking all semester possessed something worth more than all of it. The snow continued falling outside. The clock on his wall ticked steadily forward. And somewhere in the night, Dr. Hargrove made a decision that would have been unthinkable that morning. The semester ended with final exams and the chaotic exodus of students fleeing campus for winter break. Micah submitted his papers, finished his tests, and prepared to spend the holidays working double shifts at the construction company. His grade in philosophy, 321/91. Fair, given the circumstances. He'd expected worse. On the last day of exams, he returned to his studio apartment to find a note slipped under his door. Heavy cream paper, elegant handwriting. "Mr. Brennan, I need to speak with you. This is not about your grade or any academic matter. This is personal. If you're willing, please meet me at Riverside Coffee tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. I understand if you decline. Dr. Hargrove." Micah read the note 3 times. His first instinct was caution. His second was curiosity. His third, surprisingly, was compassion. Because he'd seen something in Dr. Hargrove's eyes during that final debate, something that looked almost like desperation. He texted Rebecca, "Weird thing. Hargrove wants to meet. Coffee shop. Tomorrow night. What do you think?" Her response came quickly. "Careful. Could be a trap. Want me there?" "No. I think he needs privacy." "Okay, but text me when you're there and when you leave. And if you disappear, I'm calling the police." Micah smiled. "Deal." The next evening, he walked through snow-covered streets to Riverside Coffee, a small independent shop near campus that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and espresso. His breath formed clouds in the crystalline air. His boots, still split at the sole, let in slush with each step. But the night was beautiful, silent and silver under streetlights, the sky clear and crowded with stars. Dr. Hargrove sat alone at a corner table, far from other patrons. He wore jeans, Micah had never seen him in anything but suits, and a dark sweater that made him look older, more vulnerable. His hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, white-knuckled with tension. When he saw Micah enter, relief flooded his features. "You came." His voice was rough, as though he'd been shouting or crying or both. "You asked." Micah hung his thin jacket on the chair, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Should I get something?" "Please. My treat." Micah ordered a simple black coffee, cheapest option, and returned to the table. The shop buzzed with quiet conversation, acoustic guitar music playing softly through overhead speakers. Students hunched over laptops. A couple shared a muffin, laughing softly. "Thank you for meeting me," Dr. Hargrove said. "I know I've given you no reason to trust me." "It's okay." "No, it's not." The professor's hands tightened around his mug. "I've treated you abominably all semester. I've mocked your beliefs, questioned your intelligence, made you the target of public humiliation, and you've never once retaliated." Micah sipped his coffee. "I didn't see the point in fighting." "Why not?" "I would have. If someone had done to me what I did to you, I would have destroyed them." "Maybe, but destruction isn't really my goal." Dr. Hargrove laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "See, that's exactly what I don't understand. You should hate me. You should be angry. You should want revenge. Instead, you sit here calmly drinking coffee like we're colleagues. How? Micah considered his answer carefully. This wasn't an academic debate. This was a man asking a genuine question from a place of genuine pain. "I spent a lot of years angry," he said quietly. "After my parents died, car accident when I was 15, I was so angry I couldn't see straight. Angry at them for leaving, angry at fate or chance or whatever controls these things. Angry at myself for not being in the car, for surviving when they didn't. That anger nearly killed me. Pills and alcohol and a general desire to just stop existing. I came very close to succeeding." He paused, remembering that night. The cold tile of his bathroom floor, the empty bottles, the encroaching darkness. But something happened, something I can't fully explain, a presence, a knowing, a voice that wasn't audible but was clearer than any sound. "You are loved. You are seen. You matter." And that changed everything. Not instantly. Recovery took years. But gradually I learned that peace wasn't something I achieved. It was something I received. And once I had it, once I really experienced it, anger seemed pointless. Why would I destroy what I'd fought so hard to build? Dr. Hargrove's eyes glistened. "I've spent my entire career dismantling that exact worldview, explaining it away as psychology, as survival mechanism, as delusion." "I know. And yet you're sitting here, living proof that I might be wrong, or that understanding something intellectually isn't the same as experiencing it personally." That's anti-intellectual mysticism. Maybe. But some truths require experience rather than argument. Dr. Hargrove was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm miserable, Mr. Brennan. Successful and respected and absolutely miserable. I wake up every morning with a weight on my chest. I go through my days performing competence. I go to bed every night with medication because my mind won't stop racing. I've been this way for years, and it's getting worse. And then I watch you, torn shirt, worn boots, working construction to afford tuition, taking my abuse every class. And you have peace. Real, genuine peace." And I realized something terrible. He looked directly at Micah, tears now visible on his weathered face. "I envy you. I, Dalton Hargrove, published author and tenured professor, envy a struggling student who believes in fairy tales, because you have something I don't, something I've spent decades claiming doesn't exist, and I don't know how to get it." The moment stretched between them, fragile and honest. Around them, the coffee shop continued its normal rhythms, espresso machines hissing, conversations murmuring, music playing. But at their corner table, something profound was happening. Micah felt the weight of Dr. Hargrove's confession, the vulnerability it took to admit envy, the courage it took to question everything he'd built his identity upon. And in that moment, Micah understood his role wasn't to preach or explain or defend. It was simply to be present. "I'm not special," Micah said gently. "I'm not particularly smart or strong. I'm just someone who hit bottom hard enough to realize I couldn't save myself. And in that moment of complete helplessness, I discovered something bigger than myself, something that didn't demand I earn it or deserve it, something freely offered." "Grace," Dr. Hargrove whispered. "Yeah, grace. Which sounds like nonsense unless you've needed it. And when you really need it, when you're desperate and broken and out of options, it stops being a theological concept and becomes," he searched for words, "becomes oxygen, the thing you can't live without. But how do you access it? Where do you find it? You don't find it. It finds you, usually when you stop running from it." Dr. Hargrove closed his eyes. "I've spent 20 years running. Building walls with logic and arguments, protecting myself from questions that scared me, and now I'm trapped inside those walls and they're suffocating me. Then maybe it's time to stop running. I don't know how." Micah reached across the table, placed his hand gently on Dr. Hargrove's arm. The professor flinched at the touch, then steadied. "You start by admitting you need help," Micah said, "which you just did. That's the hardest part. The rest is just learning to receive what's already being offered. What if I can't? What if I'm too far gone? Nobody's too far gone. That's the whole point. It's not about deserving, it's about accepting. Dr. Hargrove opened his eyes, and in them Micah saw something breaking, but breaking the way dawn breaks, with light flooding through cracks. I don't know if I believe. I don't know if I can believe. My mind rebels against everything my heart is saying. Then start with the doubt. Start with the questions. Start exactly where you are. Faith isn't pretending to be certain. It's admitting you're not and choosing to trust anyway. They sat together in the warm coffee shop while snow fell outside and the winter night deepened. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not professor and student, not mocker and mocked, but two humans navigating the mysteries of existence. Dr. Hargrove asked questions. Micah answered honestly, without pretense or performance. Sometimes he said, "I don't know." Sometimes he shared his own doubts. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, watching snow accumulate on the windowsills. When they finally stood to leave, Dr. Hargrove extended his hand. Micah took it. "Thank you," the professor said, "for coming, for not hating me, for showing me something I thought impossible." "Thank you for asking," Micah replied. "That took courage." "Will you—" Dr. Hargrove hesitated. "Would you be willing to meet again? After the break? I have more questions." "Of course. Any time." They walked out together into the crystal night. At the corner, they parted ways. Dr. Hargrove to his carefully ordered home, Micah to his small studio apartment. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had fallen. 3 weeks later, when spring semester began, Micah walked into Philosophy 412 and saw Dr. Hargrove at the front of the room, organizing papers. The professor looked up, caught his eye, and smiled. Not the thin, mocking smile of before, but something genuine and warm. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "good to see you." "You too, sir." The semester proceeded differently. Dr. Hargrove still challenged ideas, still demanded rigorous thinking, still pushed students beyond comfortable assumptions. But the edge of cruelty had vanished. In its place, genuine curiosity, real questions, a willingness to admit uncertainty. One February afternoon after class, Timothy Vogel approached Micah. "What happened?" he asked without preamble. "What do you mean?" "Hargrove, he's different. Less vicious. Rumor is you two had some kind of confrontation over winter break." Micah shook his head. "Not a confrontation, a conversation." "About what?" "About peace, and how to find it when you've lost it." Timothy studied him. "And did he? Find it?" "He's looking. That's the first step." "You're a strange guy, Brennan." Micah laughed. "I've been told." As weeks passed, Micah noticed small changes in Dr. Hargrove. The professor began attending a meditation group on campus. He started volunteering at a homeless shelter downtown. He smiled more. The harsh lines around his eyes softened. And one day in late March, when Micah arrived early to class, he saw Dr. Hargrove standing at the window, staring out at the blooming campus, and on his face was an expression Micah recognized. Peace. Tentative, fragile, but real. After class, Dr. Hargrove approached him. "Mr. Brennan, would you have time for coffee sometime this week?" "Sure. How about tomorrow?" They met at Riverside Coffee again, same corner table. This time Dr. Hargrove looked lighter, younger somehow, despite the grey in his hair. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "Last Sunday I went to a church service. First time in 37 years. I sat in the back row, ready to flee if necessary, and something happened." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The pastor spoke about mercy, about how we're all broken and all in need of grace. And I realized I'd spent decades seeing myself as the exception, too smart to need help, too rational to need faith. But that morning, sitting in that uncomfortable wooden pew, listening to those old hymns, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. I felt," he searched, "welcome. Not because I'd achieved anything or proven anything, just welcome." Tears appeared in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. "After the service, I spoke with the pastor, told him my story. expected judgment or triumph, famous atheist converts. But instead he just hugged me and said, "Welcome home." And I broke down completely, stood there crying like a child while this stranger held me. It was humiliating and beautiful, and I've never felt more human. Micah felt his own eyes sting. "That's incredible." "It's your fault, Dr. Hargrove smiled through tears. "You just kept showing up, kept taking my abuse, kept demonstrating peace when you had every reason to be bitter. And eventually I couldn't deny what I was seeing. You were living proof that everything I'd argued against might actually be real. I'm just one person. I could have been an anomaly. You were the anomaly I needed, the crack in my armor, the question I couldn't answer away." They sat together, two men separated by age and experience, but united by something deeper. Outside, spring was transforming campus. Trees budding, flowers emerging, students shedding heavy coats for lighter clothes. The world was renewing itself, as it did every year, indifferent to human drama, but somehow participating in it anyway. "What happens now?" Micah asked. "I don't know. I'm learning to be comfortable with not knowing. It's harder than it sounds." Dr. Hargrove sipped his coffee. "But I'm starting to understand that faith isn't certainty. It's trust despite uncertainty, and peace isn't the absence of questions. It's rest despite unanswered questions." "That's a good start. I have a long way to go. Years of intellectual pride to unlearn, walls to dismantle. But for the first time in decades, I feel like I'm moving towards something rather than running from something. And that's because of you." Micah shook his head. "Not because of me. Through me, maybe. But the peace you're finding isn't mine to give. I was just the messenger. A good messenger, though. A faithful one." They finished their coffee talking about philosophy and theology and the strange ways life upends assumptions. When they parted, Dr. Hargrove pulled Micah into an unexpected hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, for showing me grace when I showed you none." "That's what grace does," Micah said. "It shows up where it's not deserved. That's the whole point." The semester ended with spring's explosive arrival. Micah finished his classes with strong grades. His construction work picked up as weather improved. His boots remained split, his shirt remained torn, his wallet remained mostly empty. But none of it mattered quite as much, because he'd witnessed something profound: transformation. Dr. Dalton Hargrove, published author and famous skeptic, had begun a journey toward faith. Not because of clever arguments, not because someone had defeated his logic, but because he'd seen peace lived out in front of him and couldn't deny its reality. On the last day of class, Dr. Hargrove announced his retirement. He would finish the next academic year and then step away from teaching to pursue different questions in a different way. Students buzzed with speculation, but Micah understood. Some journeys required leaving familiar territory. After class, Dr. Hargrove handed Micah a sealed envelope. "Don't open this until you get home." That evening, in his small studio apartment, Micah opened the envelope to find a check for $5,000 and a handwritten letter. "Mr. Brennan, or should I say Micah, you never asked me for anything. You never demanded apology or restitution. You simply existed with grace and peace, and in doing so, changed my life. This small amount cannot repay what you've given me, but it can perhaps repair your boots and mend your shirt and give you a bit of breathing room. Use it as you see fit. But know that it comes with profound gratitude and something I never expected to feel again: hope. You showed me that peace is possible, that grace is real, that faith isn't weakness but strength. Thank you for being a faithful messenger. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing an arrogant professor that he had everything to learn. With deep respect and genuine affection, Dalton." Micah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. Because this was exactly how grace worked, not demanded, not earned, simply received and passed along, multiplying as it moved through the world. He folded the letter carefully, placed it beside his grandfather's old Bible on his shelf, and sat by his window, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, Dr. Dalton Hargrove sat in his oak-panelled office, also watching stars, also feeling something he'd thought forever lost. Peace, not perfect, not complete, but real. And in a world that often felt dark and chaotic, that small miracle was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The summer passed, with its rhythms of work and rest. Micah used part of the money to repair his boots and buy new clothes. The rest he saved, knowing construction work was seasonal and winter would come again. He continued attending his small church, continued volunteering with the youth group, continued living his quiet life of faith and service. In late August, a letter arrived at his apartment. Heavy cream paper, elegant handwriting. He opened it with curiosity. Dear Micah, I wanted you to know that I was baptized last Sunday. At 58 years old, I stood in water before a community of believers and made public my commitment to follow a path I once mocked. It was terrifying and beautiful. The pastor who baptized me, Pastor Vincent, asked if I wanted to share my testimony. I declined, not because I'm ashamed, but because I'm still learning my new language. But I thought of you. I thought of your torn shirt and worn boots and quiet peace. I thought of how you endured my cruelty with grace. And I understood that testimony isn't always words. Sometimes it's simply living faithfully when no one's watching, trusting that the right people will see what they need to see. You were my testimony. You showed me Christ before I could articulate what I was seeing. Thank you for that gift. I don't know what the future holds. I'm still filled with questions. I still struggle with doubt. But I'm learning to sit with uncertainty rather than defend against it. I'm learning to receive grace rather than earn approval. I'm learning to rest rather than achieve. These lessons don't come naturally to someone like me, but they're coming, slowly, imperfectly, really. I wanted you to know that the peace you demonstrated wasn't wasted. It took root in barren soil and produced fruit I never imagined possible. That's the mystery of grace. It works despite our resistance, not because of our receptiveness. Thank you, my young friend. Thank you for being faithfully who you are. The world is better for it. Yours in the journey, Dalton. Micah sat on his narrow bed, holding the letter, feeling the weight of words that changed everything and nothing. He hadn't set out to convert anyone. He'd simply tried to survive with integrity. And somehow, through no merit of his own, that survival had become testimony. He thought about Dr. Hargrove standing in baptismal waters, vulnerable and hopeful. He thought about the mysterious ways grace moved through the world, touching lives in patterns too complex to predict. He thought about his own journey, from pills and vodka to peace and purpose, and marveled at the strange providence that had placed him in Philosophy 321 with a professor who needed exactly what he had to offer. Not arguments, not apologetics, not clever defenses of doctrine, just peace lived out, demonstrated daily, offered freely, and somehow, against all logic and probability, it had been enough. He pulled out his phone, texted Rebecca, "Remember Hargrove, he got baptized." Her response, "What? Are you serious?" "Dead serious. Got a letter today." "That's insane. You broke him." "No, Grace broke him. I was just there." "You're too humble. Or just honest." He set his phone aside and returned to the letter, reading it again slowly. Then he folded it carefully and placed it beside Dr. Hargrove's earlier letter and his grandfather's Bible, creating a small archive of grace witnessed and recorded. Outside his window, summer evening deepened into night. Streetlights flickered on. Distant music drifted from somewhere down the block. The world continued its indifferent spinning, unaware of the small miracles happening in its midst. But Micah knew. He'd seen transformation up close. He'd watched walls crumble and hearts soften and peace emerge from the most unlikely places. And that knowing filled him with something that transcended happiness. Hope. Not naive optimism or wishful thinking, but the deep, abiding conviction that grace was real and active, and working in ways too mysterious to fully understand, but too evident to deny. He stood, stretched, and prepared for another week of construction work and classes and the ordinary challenges of being a student with limited resources and unlimited hope. His boots were repaired, his shirt was new, his wallet held a bit more than usual, but none of that mattered quite as much as the peace that remained constant regardless of circumstances, the peace that had survived mockery and emerged stronger. The peace that had somehow become the very thing a broken professor needed to find his way home. And as Micah lay down to sleep that night, his last thought before darkness took him was a simple prayer of gratitude. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you for using my brokenness for something beautiful. Thank you for peace that transcends understanding. Thank you for grace that changes everything. Morning would come. Work would demand attention. Life would continue with its mixture of struggle and joy, but underneath it all, beneath the surface chaos, peace remained, steady, unshakable, real, and that peace, more than anything else, was the truest testimony of all. The story spread through campus in whispers and speculation. Famous atheist professor converts. Students who'd taken his classes debated what it meant. Some saw intellectual weakness. Others saw courage. Most simply wondered what had caused such dramatic transformation. But those who knew, Rebecca, Timothy, a handful of others who'd witnessed the semester's strange drama, understood that transformation rarely came through argument. It came through witness. Through someone living faithfully enough, consistently enough, peacefully enough that others couldn't help but notice the difference. Micah returned to Philosophy 412 that fall, but Dr. Hargrove's office stood empty, his books packed away, his desk cleared. He'd taken early retirement to pursue theological studies at a small seminary 3 states away. Starting over at 58, his farewell email had read, learning to be a beginner again. Thank you all for your patience with an old professor who's discovering he had everything to learn. Ududi, the new philosophy professor, was younger, less intimidating, more collaborative. She fostered discussion rather than debate. Students relaxed. But some secretly missed the intellectual rigor Dr. Hargrove had demanded, even as they appreciated the gentler approach. Micah continued his studies. He graduated 2 years later with honors, debt-free thanks to construction work and careful budgeting, and one unexpected gift from a transformed professor. He stayed in town, took a full-time position with the construction company, continued serving at his church, continued living his quiet life of faith. Years passed. He married Rebecca, who'd watched the entire drama unfold and had come to appreciate the depth beneath his quiet exterior. They had 2 daughters who grew up hearing the story of their father and the professor, though Micah downplayed his role. "I just showed up," he'd say. Grace did the rest. On his 35th birthday, a package arrived. Heavy paper, careful wrapping, inside a book, newly published. The Journey Home, A Skeptic's Unexpected Transformation by Dalton Hargrove. Micah opened to the dedication page for Micah Brennan, who taught an arrogant professor the difference between knowing about peace and possessing it. You changed my life by simply living yours faithfully. This book is a small attempt to pass along what you gave so freely. Thank you for being my teacher when you were supposed to be my student. Thank you for showing me grace when I deserved none. Thank you for peace that wouldn't quit. The journey continues, but it began with you. Micah read the book in 2 days, tears flowing freely as he recognized their conversations, their coffee shop meetings, their unexpected friendship. Dr. Hargrove had written honestly about his decades of skepticism, his spiritual emptiness, his desperate search for meaning, and the unlikely catalyst for transformation. A student with worn boots and torn shirt who possessed peace the professor desperately needed. The book ended with a simple statement: "I don't have all the answers. I'm still learning." But I've discovered that peace isn't achieved through intellectual conquest. It's received through humble surrender. And the greatest minds aren't those who can argue most effectively. They're those who can live most faithfully, trusting that their lives will speak louder than their words. Micah Brennan was such a person. And though he'll be embarrassed by this book, I hope he'll forgive me for telling our story, because it's a story worth telling, a story of grace breaking through skepticism, of peace conquering pride, of a young man teaching an old fool that the most sophisticated knowledge is knowing you don't know everything, and the deepest wisdom is learning to rest in mystery rather than demand certainty. If this book helps even one person find the peace Micah showed me, then these pages will have served their purpose. And perhaps that's the best any of us can hope for, to pass along grace we've received, to share peace we've been given, to be faithful witnesses to transformation we can't take credit for. That's the journey. That's the point. That's the only thing that ultimately matters. Micah closed the book, held it against his chest and wept, not from sadness but from gratitude, because this was exactly how grace worked. It moved through the world in unexpected patterns, touching lives, changing trajectories, multiplying exponentially. He'd never sought fame or recognition. He'd simply tried to survive with integrity, and somehow his small, faithful life had become part of a larger story. He called Dr. Hargrove, now Pastor Hargrove, leading a small church in Vermont, and they talked for an hour about grace and gratitude and the mysterious ways transformation happens. "I'm proud of you," Micah said. "I'm proud of us," Hargrove replied. "We're both different people than we were, both still learning, both still stumbling forward. But we're doing it together, in a sense. You're still teaching me, even years later. And you're still teaching me about courage, about being willing to change, about starting over when necessary." They promised to visit. They hung up with mutual affection. And Micah sat in his small home, larger than his studio apartment had been, but still modest, watching his daughters play in the backyard, feeling his wife's hand on his shoulder, marveling at the strange and beautiful journey that had brought him here. From near suicide to peace, from mockery to friendship, from brokenness to wholeness. The journey wasn't finished. Challenges remained. Life still brought pain and uncertainty. But beneath it all, underneath every struggle and joy, peace remained constant. The peace that had survived a semester of mockery, the peace that had transformed a skeptical professor, the peace that continued to anchor Micah through every storm. And as evening settled over his small backyard, as his daughters laughed and his wife hummed softly beside him, Micah offered a simple prayer. "Thank you for using broken vessels. Thank you for grace that changes everything. Thank you for peace that transcends understanding. Thank you for letting me be part of your story. May I continue to be faithful. May I continue to point others toward you, not through words but through life, lived honestly. May my torn shirts and worn boots become testimonies to grace received and shared. May I never forget that transformation isn't my work, but yours. And may others find in my life what Dr. Hargrove found, evidence that peace is possible, grace is real, and faith isn't weakness but strength. Use me however you will. I'm yours." The sun set, stars emerged, the world continued spinning, and in 1,000 small ways, in 1,000 quiet moments, grace continued its mysterious work, moving through faithful lives, transforming skeptical hearts, multiplying peace in ways too wonderful to fully comprehend, but too real to deny. Because that's what grace does. It shows up where it's least expected. It works through unlikely messengers. It transforms impossible situations. It breaks through intellectual barriers and emotional defenses. It creates peace from chaos. It brings hope from despair. It makes all things new. And sometimes, just sometimes, it uses a struggling student with worn boots and a torn shirt to change a professor's life forever. Not through argument, not through persuasion, but through faithful presence, through peace lived out, through grace received and shared, through the simple, profound act of showing up and being human and trusting that transformation is possible even when it seems impossible. That was Micah's testimony. That was Dr. Hargrove's transformation. That was grace in action. And that, more than any intellectual argument, more than any philosophical treatise, more than any carefully crafted apologetic, was the most convincing evidence that peace is real, grace exists, and faith isn't foolish but foundational. The story continued. Lives were changed. Grace multiplied. And somewhere in the ongoing narrative of existence, two men, once adversaries, now brothers, walked their separate but connected paths, bound by shared transformation, united by mysterious grace, living testimonies that peace is possible, and change is real, and hope never dies, because grace, once received, demands to be shared, and peace, once discovered, becomes contagious, and faith, once embraced, transforms everything it touches. That's the journey. That's the mystery. That's the hope we all carry forward into whatever comes next. May we all be so faithful. May we all demonstrate such peace. May we all become living testimonies to grace that changes everything. And may our lives speak louder than our words, pointing others toward the source of peace we cannot explain but cannot deny. That's the gift Micah gave Dr. Hargrove. That's the gift we're all called to give each other. That's the story worth telling, again and again and again, until everyone who needs to hear it finally understands. Peace is possible, grace is real, faith isn't foolish, and transformation can happen to anyone, even skeptical professors, even broken students, even you, even me. That's the gospel truth. That's the hope we carry. That's the story that never gets old, because grace never runs out, and peace never stops working, and love never fails. Never, ever. Amen.